Excuse me again, we're going to go ahead and call the committee to order because I know we've got witnesses and a lot of other folks with places to be. And hopefully while Mr. Baird and I are making our opening statements, Mr. Ehlers will show up. Mr. Thornberry had a different briefing this morning and had already informed us that he'd be a little bit late. So we'll just go ahead and get started. So call the committee to order, and it's a joint committee this morning between the Terrorism, Unconventional Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee, and we are joined by Mr. Baird from the Science Subcommittee on Research and Science Education from the Committee on Science and Technology. And appreciate all of you being here. We are here this morning to discuss the role of social and behavioral science in national security. I have an opening statement which I will submit for the record, but having read the witness testimony yesterday, I think this will be a very interesting hearing, which touches on a number of different issues. Certainly understanding the cultures of the communities that our military forces are going into are critical wherever they are, and it varies from community to community, but it is a critical element in the type of warfare that we're fighting now, especially, which is basically counterinsurgency, where we're trying to win over the local population. So understanding their cultures, their interests, and their human behavior and how it varies from place to place is critical. But also very interesting is some of the studies that are going on in terms of evaluating overall populations so that you can begin to predict behavior of those populations. And predicting that behavior can have a huge impact on military decisions on a number of different levels. And that is an area that, frankly, I don't understand, and I'm very interested to hear this morning about how we're developing that as well as the other issues that have been raised. And with that, I will turn it over to my Washington State colleague from the Science Committee, Representative Baird, for any opening statement he has.
I want to thank Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, and their staff, particularly our good friend Tim McLeese for his work on this, and also my staff on the Science Committee and my personal staff. Dr. Ehlers also has been very instrumental in this. As a clinical psychologist by training, but someone who's taken a great interest in defense issues as well, I find this a particularly exciting and interesting topic. Many, I think, members of the public and the media have been rather surprised to learn about the role of behavioral and social sciences in our defense strategies, but as Chairman Smith mentioned, the changes in the type of warfare we're fighting and the situations our soldiers are finding themselves in necessitate this kind of preparation and this kind of research. It struck me as I was in Iraq last time, we were in one of the new MRAP vehicles. And of course, when it was discovered that those, or demonstrated that those vehicles saved a lot of lives, we spared virtually no expense to get them into the field to protect our soldiers. As our witnesses today are going to report, and from some of the written testimony, some of the interventions that we're seeing and the advice getting to our soldiers in the field from the social sciences is saving lives as well. And helping understand that role in our military posture, in the training of our troops, in our international involvement, I think is particularly important, as is the importance of understanding the stresses and opportunities and strengths facing our soldiers and their families here at home. And the extensive research that we hear about today in that area is particularly illuminating. I think it's especially exciting that we have research in this area being done by both the NSF and by the armed services. To be perfectly honest, I think joint committee hearings are relatively rare in this institution. We've seen siloing elsewhere in the government and realized that was not a good idea. And thanks to Chairman Smith and the staff on the Republican and Democratic side, we're bringing two different committees which people might not usually see as having common interests together around something I think will be quite illuminating. So I thank our witnesses today for not only for being here, but far more importantly for your lifetime of service through your research and your service in the military. Thank you. We look forward very much for your testimony, and I'm glad you're here. Very grateful.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Ehlers for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for being late. I was chairing another meeting, and unfortunately I have to leave for yet another one almost immediately. But I appreciate you calling this hearing. I'm pleased to be a part of this joint hearing because I agree that social and behavioral science research has a tremendous role to play in the security of our nation. General Patton, who, as you probably know, did not practice social sciences very well, said wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men. It is the spirit of the men who follow and of the man who leads that gains the victory. Social and behavioral research can help us determine what motivates the spirit of our military men and women and their leaders, as well as those who wish our nation harm. And it's perhaps that last category where we need help in understanding the unorthodox enemies that we face in the world today. I meant unorthodox in the non-religious sense. Clearly, most of them are orthodox in the religious sense. I know that the National Science Foundation is doing yeoman work in the social and behavioral sciences, much of which could have applications for our military. And I look forward to hearing today about the behavioral science research currently being conducted by the Department of Defense and how that research is being applied. This issue creates numerous opportunities for these two agencies, namely Department of Defense and National Science Foundation, to work together on the research areas recommended in the National Research Council and U.S. Army Institute for the Behavioral and Social Sciences Study, Human Behavior in Military Context. In the military context, an advanced understanding of other cultures, teamwork in complex environments, technology-based training, nonverbal behavior, emotion, and behavioral neurophysiology can make the difference between life and death. These factors affect more than the Army combat engineer on the ground in Iraq and her family here at home, or the Navy admiral and everyone under his command. They also affect all of our service members, all the families that support them, all of us whom they are defending, and yes, even those who threaten our freedom. Therefore, social and behavioral research is of crucial importance to this entire nation and our own security as we move forward in an ever-changing world filled not only with new technological achievements, but also with increasingly complicated human dimensions. I certainly want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. I look forward to their testimony. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. With that, we'll go to our witness statements and then go to questions. I want to welcome our panel. I'll introduce all of you first and then go in order in terms of your testimony. First, we're joined by Dr. Andre van Tilborg, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Science and Technology. Welcome. Colonel Martin Schweitzer, Commander 4th Brigade Combat Team, 82nd Airborne Division. Dr. Mark Weiss, Division Director for Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences at the National Science Foundation. And Dr. David Segal, Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center for Research on Military Organizations at the University of Maryland. And before you start, I just want to echo something that Congressman Baird said, and that is the importance of joint hearings, because what I'm discovering in a lot of the areas in national security, particularly now when we're looking at asymmetric warfare, counterinsurgency, dealing with all these issues, there is so much crossover from agency to agency. Traditionally, there's been an enormous amount of crossover within the Department of Defense, just within their different agencies. But now, increasingly, we're seeing it move over into areas that are outside of the DoD. So finding ways for those different organizations to work together and be coordinated is enormously important, and we certainly need to start here in Congress. So I appreciate that aspect of this hearing as well. And with that, we will start with Dr. Van Tilborg. Please go ahead.
Chairman Smith, Chairman Baird, ranking members, and distinguished members of both subcommittees, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the role of the behavioral and social sciences in national security. My name is Andre Van Tilborg. I am the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Science and Technology. This morning, I will limit my remarks to only a few of the department's research efforts that specifically relate to unconventional warfare and the global war on terror. First, a very short history lesson apropos to the theme of today's hearing. In roughly the year 512 BC, a Chinese military strategist named Sun Tzu wrote a remarkably timeless handbook of pithy advice for warfighters called The Art of War. In this book, Sun Tzu writes the following admonition: know your enemy. End of history lesson. 2,500 years later, a National Academy of Sciences panel on human behavior in military contexts reminds us that people are the heart of all military efforts. Similarly, the Defense Science Board writes that DoD must gain deeper understanding of how individuals, groups, societies, and nations behave. And just last week, the Secretary of Defense told the Association of American Universities that DoD must, quote, must further its understanding of foreign countries and cultures with the help of the social sciences research community. Today, our nation confronts the challenges of irregular warfare. The battlefields are often civilian neighborhoods where our forces come into personal contact with an indistinguishable mix of combatants, innocents, and unknowns. Adequate cultural knowledge can make the difference between gun battles and non-kinetic conflict resolution, and can be used to shape the optimal balance of combat power and diplomacy. This fiscal year, DoD's investment in social science research is roughly $150 million, of which about a third is focused on the topic of today's hearing. That amount represents slightly more than 1% of DoD's science and technology appropriation. Relevant social science research is sponsored broadly in the department, including the military services, DARPA, and the Director of Defense Research and Engineering. The DDR&E launched a vertically integrated research initiative budgeted at $10 million this year called Human Social Culture and Behavior Modeling, HSCB for short. HSCB is focused on developing the required science base and on maturing technologies that support cultural understanding and forecasting across a range of mission areas and geographic regions. As an adjunct to the HSCB, the department is using the Small Business Innovation Research Program to invest another $10 million this year on topics such as training soldiers to decode nonverbal cues in cross-cultural interactions and secondary language retention in non-Western languages. In addition, the department's multidisciplinary university research initiative has made two $1 million per year grant awards to universities for research in computational modeling of adversary attitudes and behavior. Also, the Army Research Institute funds research into how to think about culture in contrast to how to memorize facts about specific cultures. DARPA is conducting relevant research in a program called Integrated Crisis Early Warning System, and also makes considerable investments in foreign language translation technologies. The human terrain system that Colonel Schweitzer will discuss shortly represents only one of many ways in which the research results from these S&T investments can be employed. The department coordinates its social science research through many venues, including recent scientific conferences such as the First International Conference on Computational Cultural Dynamics, sponsored by the Air Force Research Lab, and the First International Workshop on Social Computing, Behavioral Modeling, and Prediction, with participation by DARPA, ONR, AFRL, ARO, and other agencies. Mr. Chairman, distinguished members, I ask that you recall from my opening testimony the recommendations of the DSB, the National Academies, and yes, the military strategist Sun Tzu, to learn as much as possible about the behavioral, social, and cultural aspects of our adversaries and of the indigenous populations in which U.S. and coalition forces operate. DoD's S&T enterprise has both anticipated and listened to this advice. In conducting this research, it is crucial that DoD continue to respect the scientific integrity of the academic disciplines on which we depend. Thank you for this opportunity to address both subcommittees and for your continued support. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now turn to Colonel Schweitzer, and I do want to acknowledge his service. He's just returned, I guess, 10 days ago, according to my notes, from a 15-month tour in Afghanistan, and his unit was the first to deploy with the Pilot Human Terrain Team program. So we look forward to your insights from your experience in the field. Colonel Schweitzer.
Mr. Chairman Smith, Chairman Byrd, ranking members of both subcommittees, thank you for this opportunity to testify how mission-critical irregular warfare, non-traditional and non-kinetic enabling capabilities and technology are achieving desired effects in Afghanistan. Having just 10 days ago returned from a 15-month deployment, let me first thank the Congress and the nation for your continued support as we persevere against a determined, adaptable enemy. The context of my comments today will be the 4th Brigade Combat Team, 82nd Airborne Division's experience in Afghanistan, and specifically the significant non-kinetic effects the Pilot Human Terrain System program provided to our combat leaders at all levels within the brigade. Let me first explain what the Human Terrain System is. It is a capability to assist commanders and soldiers to better understand the human terrain they are surrounded by and discern soft power means of achieving desired effects. It is built around a 5 to 8 person human terrain team, HTT, at the brigade combat team level, comprised of social scientists and other trained military personnel. They use a mapping human terrain toolkit to assist with research and analysis and maintaining human terrain data repository concerning local population, social groups, interests, beliefs, motivating factors, leaders, etc. HTTs do not merely serve as embedded cultural advisors for commanders, but they assist commanders at every level to maneuver formations within local communities in such a manner that reduces the threat to all parties involved. To help with this, there is a theater-specific Reachback Research Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which provides 24/7 subject matter expert support for deployed teams. So what did all this mean for our deployment? It meant by better understanding the human terrain, we reduced the number of kinetic operations that otherwise would have occurred. Not only did we reduce the risk to our soldiers, but we reduced the risk significantly to the communities that we operated within. Subsequently, we were able to assist linking the people of Afghanistan to their government at an incredibly accelerated rate. Bottom line, my headquarters is uniquely qualified to focus on the enemy as the center of gravity. However, today the people are the center of gravity, not the enemy. The brigade headquarters requires enablers to optimize their effectiveness. One of the enablers is this HTS capability, which allows the headquarters to better focus its efforts on the correct center of gravity. Now let me tell you what an HTT is not. The team is not an intelligence gathering tool which is used to target individuals. My staff is uniquely organized to run the targeting process and link intelligence system to time-sensitive targeting. The HTT sourced with social scientists is not qualified or trained to provide targeting support. Last year, the Army fielded an HTT to my unit as a proof of concept. The HTT was immediately value-added and became mission-critical. The team's impacts were exponentially powerful, reduced our kinetic operations, assisted in developing more effective non-kinetic courses of action, improved the unit's overall situational awareness, improved consequence management, increased host nation government support, improved the brigade's humanitarian assistance efforts, improved village assessments, improved information operations capabilities, decreased enemy forces attacks, decreased ordinary crime in our area of operation. Without the HTT filter on courses of action and the alternative maneuver tools they identified to create the exact same effect, we would have lost double, in my assessment, double the lives, both military and civilian. Using HTT capabilities, we reduced kinetic operations by 60 to 70% during our 15-month deployment. To illustrate the HTT's effectiveness, I'd like to share a few vignettes. In the words of one of my company commanders, without the HTT, our actions would not have been as precise. If the teams weren't there, I would have corridoured off the village, gathered local elders, and told them what we were doing. I would have told them to show me their personally owned weapons, and if they didn't show us their weapons, we would have taken them. Because of the HTT, I understood my alternatives. If you could have one for every company commander, they would be a phenomenal asset. According to one of my provincial reconstruction team commanders, their expertise rapidly identified who to talk to in the village. We were just ricocheting around before they got there, talking to random people. The HTT saved me an enormous amount of time, 10 to 20 hours per village, in terms of who to talk to. I would take those guys any day of the week. And then finally, the HTT helped the 203rd Afghan National Army Corps in our brigade develop non-kinetic courses of action during combat operations. To provide a specific example, in the Ghazni province, the Taliban had regularly attacked the government of Afghanistan, leaders, coalition, Afghan National Army, and Afghan National Police for over 5 years. Despite a very aggressive outreach to village elders, the HTT questioned the use of kinetic courses of action in the area, observing that the true power brokers in the areas were the mullahs and not the village elders. After redirecting our outreach effort to the mullahs, the brigade experienced a rapid and dramatic decrease in Taliban attacks to the point where this area is currently attack-free. Bottom line, for 5 years, we got nothing from the people of the Ghazni province. After meeting with the mullahs, we had no more bullets for 28 days, captured 80 Afghan-born Taliban and 32 foreign fighters without a shot being fired. As a result of this operation last June, Ghazni province today no longer harbors the shadow Taliban government. So what was the net effect? When we took over in early 2007, only 19 of the 86 formal and informal districts supported the government. Today we assess 72 of those same districts support their government. I absolutely attribute some of this change to the HTT. I could elaborate with more metrics and examples of HTT success. But let me conclude. We learned that the population is the key to the center of gravity. The enemy is hiding among the people, and we must understand the culture to win. However, it is more than just the culture. It is understanding their norms and values from an operational standpoint that creates a bridge between the people and their government, which currently does not exist. The HTT's contribution to Brigade's ability to assess their operating environments, to routinely develop and consider non-lethal input to military planning, and to achieve greater operational success with less kinetic operations is invaluable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel. Dr. Weiss.
And distinguished members of the subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the social, behavioral, and economic, or SBE, sciences and their relationship to the military. The SBE sciences are concerned with human actions at every level, from an individual's brain to individual behavior to the actions of social groups and organizations. From fighting the war on terrorism to understanding and overseeing an immense organization, SBE research can assist military policymakers in developing knowledge-based solutions. About a dozen different disciplines comprise the SBE sciences. Anthropologists study the workings of cultures and societies. Neuroscientists and psychologists probe the inner workings of the mind and brain. Linguists seek the neural basis of language. And economists, political scientists, sociologists, and geographers map the forces at work in today's societies. Collectively, these researchers study team building, risk management, metrics for assessing U.S. competitiveness, disaster response, radicalization, the dynamics of conflict, and much more. Federal support of basic SBE research is largely provided by NSF through grants to researchers, most of whom are located in U.S. academic institutions. NSF provides about 60% of the federal support for basic research in anthropology, social psychology, and the social sciences. For some disciplines, NSF supplies more than 90% of the funding. And we estimate that approximately 10 to 15% of this research might be of clear and immediate interest to the military. In fact, NSF supports significant levels of basic research in all 6 of the major research areas called for in the National Research Council's Human Behavior in Military Contexts report: intercultural competence, teams in complex environments, technology and training, nonverbal behavior, emotion, and behavioral neurophysiology. Each subject is relevant to the military in a variety of areas, including leadership, training, personnel, social interactions, and organizational structures. I'll illustrate with 3 recent SBE awards from what I believe is a rich and diverse portfolio of SBE relevant research relevant to the DoD mission. First, the University of Michigan researchers are studying human behavior motivated by ethical or religious beliefs. This research has far-reaching implications for military operations in regions where religious beliefs heavily influence local cultural and political systems. Second, the Learning in Informal and Formal Environments Center is an interdisciplinary collaboration led by scientists at the University of Washington and Stanford University. Its goal is to unlock the powers of human learning. This research will provide valuable insight to any organization that trains an ethnically diverse population of young adults, such as the military. And third, researchers at the City University of New York are studying our ability to selectively attend to the relevant elements in our environment while ignoring distracting information. This skill is of supreme importance in a military setting. Many NSF-supported research projects such as these could inform DoD efforts. With an increasing appreciation of the benefits that accrue to the military via SBE research, NSF and DoD might co-develop innovative solicitations. NSF can also provide expertise on the process of peer review. And NSF has very strong ties to the academic community, which could be leveraged to help develop new DoD research themes. NSF program managers might also provide the military with novel perspectives on the potential applications of SBE research. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittees, I hope that I've been able to articulate NSF's unique role in supporting fundamental social, behavioral, and economic research, and the added value that NSF-supported research might provide to the DoD. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you. I'd be happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Segal.
Congressman Smith, Congressman Baird, esteemed members of the subcommittees, I'm honored to have been invited to testify to you on the role of the social and behavioral sciences in national security. I've been asked to address 4 issues, and although I'm a professor, I'll try to be brief. First, I've been asked to provide an overview of the University of Maryland Center for Research on Military Organization. The Sociology Department at Maryland is unique in that it has continuously taught courses in military sociology and the sociology of war since World War II. I was not there at the time. Military sociology is a relatively small field, and our program is the largest in the nation. In 1995, the research efforts of a number of faculty and graduate students were consolidated into the Center for Research on Military Organization. We were designated a Center of Excellence by the Army Research Institute for the Behavioral and Social Sciences, with the dual missions of conducting cutting-edge research and educating a successor generation of military sociologists. Our research program has 4 primary foci: diversity in the military, military families, military operations, and the intersection of the military and society. Our program is currently implemented by 4 faculty members, 10 graduate students, and 1 postdoctoral research fellow. Since 1985, we have granted 18 PhD degrees to students specializing in the study of the military, 10 of them since the year 2000. Over the last decade, our research has been supported by over $4 million in extramural funding. More than 80% of it has come from the Army Research Institute, about 14% has come from the National Science Foundation, about 6% has come from industry, the remainder has come from private foundations. Second, I've been asked how research such as ours can achieve national security goals. Research in the social and behavioral sciences has supported America's armed forces in maximizing soldier and unit performance since World War I, when psychologists first developed tests to determine who should serve and in what jobs. In World War II, a generation of America's best sociologists and social psychologists were mobilized to support soldier morale and performance through survey research and training experiments. Today, as the domestic labor force and the international environment change, the social and behavioral sciences can make continued contributions. Understanding the nature of culture and cultural differences, for example, can help soldiers function in a force that itself is increasingly culturally diverse, reflecting the changing ethnic and racial composition of society. It will help them participate in coalition operations where they share the battle space with allies who come from different cultural backgrounds. And it will help them function in unconventional military operations where the opponent is not a modern army whose soldiers wear uniforms that distinguish them both from friendly forces and from indigenous civilians, but rather irregular forces who blend in with the local population. In addition, the increasing importance of small units in these operations highlights the potential contributions of research on group processes, such as cohesion and leadership, a research area in which the armed forces currently invest less heavily than they did in the years after the Korean War. Third, I was asked to identify current and emerging areas of research that can contribute to the effectiveness of our national security apparatus. Many of the important areas, such as cohesion and leadership, have long been important, but continued research is necessary as research methods and concepts evolve. Others are identified in the 2008 National Research Council report on human behavior in military contexts, which has been referred to already. This volume focuses on the contributions of psychology, and particularly on cognitive psychology. Other social sciences and other fields of psychology also have contributions to make. At the individual level, research on the life course decisions of young and old Americans contribute both to an improved understanding of the decisions they make on choices of trajectory, whether they go into the military services, into civilian employment, or to universities, as well as how the nation can best serve its veterans who have incurred personal cost through their contributions to our defense. At the institutional level, research on the ways in which American organizations and professions are being restructured can contribute to our understanding of the contemporary military profession, its organization, and its relation to society. In researching the military, new research tools, such as computer and web-based survey research, may make data collection easier. Qualitative research approaches, such as ethnographic and archival research, can enrich the statistical pictures that our surveys provide. Application of recent theoretical approaches, such as culture theory and social network theory, can help us understand the structure of the military, its relationship to society, and the adversaries we are likely to have to face. Finally, I have been asked to comment on how we communicate our findings to DoD and the military services. Part of this is done through normal vehicles of science, meetings of professional associations that span the civilian and military boundary, and peer-reviewed journals of these organizations. We also contribute to user-oriented scientific reports published by the armed forces. Perhaps most importantly, we have found the military to be enthusiastic consumers of our research, and are frequently asked to serve as consultants to senior military leaders and to participate in military conferences and study groups. Thank you very much for your attention. I will be happy to expand on any of these points and answer any questions you might have.
Thank you all very much. I think we'll stick to the 5-minute rule for everybody, and we'll probably have time to go around for a second round of questions if you don't get all of them answered in the first 5 minutes. I'll start. I guess the first question I'm interested in focusing on Afghanistan and Iraq, but this can apply elsewhere. How do you gather the cultural information that Colonel Schweitzer talked about in terms of how useful it was? How do you go about figuring out, what the rules are in a given Afghan village or Iraqi village, or I've also been to the southern Philippines where we're doing some of this. How do you gather that information, and how do you basically make sure that it is reliable? And I don't know if Dr. Van Tilborg or Colonel Schweitzer, you can answer that.
Sir, I'll just summarize it if I could, and then expand it if there's a requirement. The human terrain teams, we embed them within the provisional reconstruction teams ahead of the operation that's going to be conducted. The provisional reconstruction teams, by their very nature, have incredible access to the population, but not trust, nor do they understand the human dimension that they're operating within. Right. So using that access vehicle, the human terrain team then engages the community leaders, identifies who they are. And
the human terrain team, sorry to interrupt, is trained how? Are they a mix of military and civilian, just one or the other?
So they have some uniformed personnel assigned to the teams, but the teams are built around the social science, folks from the social science community that bring the unique skill sets and the processes to do the human dimension analysis, to capture the norms, values, cultural challenges, or ways that they operate on.
And they will have some background in the specific culture where they're headed to, I assume?
So they may, but I got to tell you, we found out that is not a precondition.
Okay.
The precondition that we found out is the process that the anthropological community has been trained on their whole lives. And that process is much more important than their respective regional area of experience.
So
now,
knowing what
truly
to look
it
for,
helps.
Knowing what to look for, whether you've seen it before or not. Okay.
Yes, sir. And it does help. I mean, if they have experiences from that perspective, if they're an Afghan expert, absolutely, it's value added. But we found that it's not a necessity. And so they collect up, through their engagements, through their constant pressure. And look, here's the other piece. It's not done on one visit. Nothing's done on one visit. This is an Afghan timeline, not a Western watch. And so to get the human terrain teams down there to create the relationships, to get the dialogue going takes time. They've got to capture the assessments and analysis that they're making. And then they bring that back. They use their reach back to that facility that I spoke to at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to confirm or deny behaviors. And then they turn that into usable information for maneuver commanders so we can properly engage and operate within those communities, reducing friction.
Thank you. In terms of the number of these teams that we have, now there are a number of different places, other than Iraq and Afghanistan that this is applicable to, I understand, but just focusing on those two places, how many HTTs do we have deployed in either Afghanistan or Iraq?
So there's a total of 8 as of today. The second team just came in yesterday to Afghanistan and is stationed in the northern portion of Regional Command East. And then there are 6 additional teams in Iraq, is what my current understanding is.
To really cover those areas, how many would we need?
Sir, if, that's a great question.
Go ahead, throw a big number at me. That's fine. I mean,
here's
seriously.
what I would tell you.
Right.
My assessment is, and this is just mine, that every battalion, every 05 command needs a human terrain team assigned to it, and not just at game time. Deploying them is certainly an approach that enables that command to maneuver within the communities. But if we wanted to optimize the battalion's ability to make the people the center of gravity, to link people to their government, those human terrain teams need to be assigned to the unit months before its deployment. So you can train, develop the relationships, go through the training center, conduct a series of simulations, so you train just not the staffs and just not the commanders, but the young staff sergeant who's on the ground in Afghanistan engaging that mullah or tribal leader within a particular village.
So we're talking dozens,
So
basically.
for example, I had 1205 commands, 8 maneuver, 4 PRTs. I would like a human terrain team in each one of those 05 commands. Additionally, I'd like one at the brigade level, which I currently have one that I used at the brigade level for planning, and then we would send it out to the subordinate formations for operational execution.
And how many members on an HTT?
Sir, it's scalable. Right now it's 5 to 8, and it's based upon the problem and size density. Now, frankly, it's still a pilot program, and I think the ultimate manning has yet to be determined.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Barrett.
Absolutely fascinating. I want to echo the chair's thanks to all of you. The issue of training, I used the MRAP analogy. I used the MRAP analogy earlier, and we really rushed those into service. It probably can't rush folks into this training, but what needs to happen? I saw Dr. Segal nodding his head earlier when Colonel Schweitzer was speaking in terms of getting folks into integrated into the force early on. Two questions. What needs to happen in terms of training people to do this? What would seem some kind of a hybrid between social science training, military, understanding how the military works. If our academic institutions or businesses or someone else or the military itself were to ramp up to try to get folks, what needs to happen in that area? Dr. Segal, I'll start with you and then any of the others.
Well, I'll answer anecdotally because it's the quickest way I know. We have students who are serving officers who come through our program and then go out in the field. And one of our PhDs, who, by the way, applied social network training to help capture Saddam Hussein, is now commanding a Stryker battalion getting ready to go back to Iraq. And his sensitivity to what is important in culture is being transmitted to his company commanders and to his soldiers. Now, this is not a substitute for a human terrain team, but if you've got to come in at some level, coming in at the battalion commander, company commander level, and assuming that you can teach some cultural sensitivity at those levels, including it then in company and squad training down through the force, I think is a good start.
Colonel Schweitzer?
Sir, it's we were discussing this in the last couple of days, and let me explain it in this manner if I can. When we built the Stryker brigades back in the late 90s, and I think we did that correctly. We did a series of simulations. We developed the tactics, techniques, and procedures. We developed the playbook, if you will, and then we equipped and manned the force, and then we put it into a training environment and we trained it. Well, with the human terrain teams, one could argue we did this a little bit ass backwards. We had the maneuver formation, then we gave it the human terrain team and built an airplane while in flight. Probably not the way we want to do business. So I would tell you, let's default back to how we built the Stryker brigade, because what we're developing is a capability and a capacity that ultimately is going to be, I believe, my opinion, an enduring requirement for military formations to be able to have that skill set in their tool bag to make the people the center of gravity so we can link government to their people.
A dear friend of mine was former general commander of the 104th Timberwolf Division out of my district, and he's of the belief that the reserves might be a good way to do this and maybe break our reserves into, not break, but assign responsibilities for different regions of the world and then pre-train people on this kind of skill in addition to their warfighting. Maybe not in addition. Maybe this is central too. Maybe the addition is the wrong terms.
So where it actually resides, that's certainly one solution. That's probably a bit beyond my purview, but I am convinced of this, that the capability itself is one that's a necessity for maneuver formations to have, because despite the conflicts that we're going to be in the future, clearly this asymmetrical enemy within the population are going to be present, and that's now a given. And since that doesn't look like it's going to change and we're going to go back to a symmetrical type of warfare, not having this tool in the kit bag, not being educated, and I'll tell you, it can't be limited to the officer corps. It's not, when I say commanders, I mean commands. So the squad leaders and above need to have these skill sets, so when they're doing these engagements, they're properly equipped to link in with the human terrain teams, with the PRT, provincial reconstruction teams, so they can then create the most important effect, which is freedom.
Well put, and I want to thank you and all your forces for helping bring that freedom to people. Dr. Tilborg, you mentioned earlier that it's not memorization of facts, it's a way of thinking. Could you expand on that?
Yes. Actually, I wanted to follow up a little bit on what Colonel Schweitzer was saying here. I think the point being to train as many of the deploying troops as possible, not just certain individuals. And I think what's critical here include language skills. Language is well known to be very important to an understanding of cultures. And I think what we need to be able to do is employ to a much greater degree than we do currently various forms of immersive training, sometimes referred to as games, but they're a lot more than games. They're much more serious than that. The department's S&T program has developed some rather important capabilities in this immersive training regime. And we also need to draw more upon distance learning kinds of techniques, so that a larger group that goes to be deployed has this kind of knowledge when they go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Ellsworth, and then Mr. Conaway will be after Mr. Ellsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for witnessing here today. And Colonel, thank you for your service, and glad you're back home. I was just kind of curious. We're pretty big on stats and numbers, and when we're spending the people's money, they like to know this many MRAPs, this many bullets, this many bombs. Can you tell me a little bit about the measurements of success? I know, Colonel, you were saying that you had this much less violence, or just could you tell me a little bit more how you're measuring these? And I know it's a pilot program, but how are we measuring the success that we can report back to our folks or to us?
Sure. I'll first speak to the threat, which, unfortunately is measured only in terms of kinetic, the number of bullets fired and the number of people injured, which really is it's probably a mistake to measure it only in that manner. So let me put two together. Prior to using the human terrain teams in Afghanistan, the previous 5 combined operations with the Afghan National Army resulted with about 30 or 40 enemy killed, and my memory says about 15 to 20 civilians were also killed. Now, I don't know if that's exactly right, but that's the ballpark. The 5 operations we did with the human terrain teams, the 5 that we did that spanned just under 6 months, had a total of 0 civilian casualties, 0 enemy casualties, over 100 Taliban detained, over about 50 cumulative foreign fighters during that 5 operations. So that's one measure. Another measure, and I think is the one that's more important, are the number of districts that are now in support of its government because of one of the things that the human terrain team's contribution to creating access. The human terrain teams helped us create access to population centers that we previously did not have access to. And when I say we, I'm not talking coalition, I'm talking the Afghan-led effort which we were in support of. And so what's the effect of that? Well, the effect of that is district and provincial governors being able to get down there to these communities to be able to address and attend to their needs and then provide for basic service, which I think is what government's all about. And then once they did that over a period of time, the people for the first time in 35 years in Afghanistan had an alternate choice. Not of oppression, not of this constant fear of death or reprisal, but a government trying to take care of them. And it wasn't perfect, and it's not perfect today. But the numbers don't lie when we say 19 of 86 districts before we used the human terrain team, and today we're at 72. Do I think that the human terrain team is the only reason why? No. I think that there's a bunch of things that you guys have sourced, and we're incredibly thankful for what you all have done for us. everything from JIETO to the law enforcement personnel, to the CERT money, to all those things that you're giving unit commanders on the ground. But the human terrain teams played a critical role in that, of it, creating that access.
Thank you. What about losses on our side? These HTTs, the civilian members, non-soldier, have we had casualties?
So we have not had casualties to date, but when we talk about the number of casualties on the uniform side, when I said that the 5 operations that we did, I left out the coalition casualty. There were no coalition casualties in those 5 operations that spanned just under 6 months. So I think it's a contributing factor. I also, have to acknowledge the development and performance of the Afghan government, but it's a connected entity. The government's able to develop because it's being provided daily opportunities to provide for their people. It's being able to provide those daily opportunities because the access that's there. The access that's there has been created or contributed to the creation of from the human terrain teams.
What about the acceptance from the troops, the uniformed people? I know in my former life, when I'd introduce something new to my officers, that sometimes there was resistance. How are you meeting that, or what's your reaction?
This is my 6th or 7th deployment. I've been deploying since 1989, and so when the enemy was the center of gravity, this capability was not required. Now that the people are the center of gravity, I'll just use the quotes that I use from my subordinate commanders. It's a desired commodity, capability that we need so we can make the people the center of gravity. I will tell you that no one likes to get shot at, particularly in Afghanistan. It's an unpopular insurgency. The death of any, whether it's the enemy Taliban or an innocent, is a step back. And so as we can continue to develop tools that enable us to engage communities and settle the disputes through governance, it's a win for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Conaway.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, thank you, gentlemen. I apologize if this question replows ground you guys have already plowed, but mapping human terrain is not a term that I intuitively understand what you're talking about. Could you go through that a little bit and explain exactly?
So let me just topically answer that, because what you're asking me is what's, this toolbox. And like any mechanic, I understand the toolbox and I can see him use the tools. I don't know much more beyond that, quite frankly. But simply stated, the MHAP kit is it's a piece of hardware. It's a computer laptop that it's used to produce the products and decision-making tools that enable the subordinate commander to figure out how he best can conduct maneuvers inside a respective community. It's also used as a repository, as a handoff. So as we do the reliefs in place between the brigades, the battalions, the companies, the provincial reconstruction teams, and the human terrain teams themselves, that they have a good constant handoff of material and data and information that gets handed off. So it's really their hardware and software system, from my view, that provides me those necessary tools that we can then go out and give to our subordinate commanders and sergeants who engage with these communities. Anything beyond that, sir, it's beyond my expertise.
Give me an example of what a tool is, and how do you gather the data that's in the toolkit?
Okay, sir, that's we did cover that, but so I'll just summarize it if I can.
Thank you.
Now, the human terrain teams normally get embedded inside the provincial reconstruction teams.
I understand that, but you said it's a tool. What is it that they've gathered? The number of brown-haired folks versus...
No, sir. Let me give you an example and see if that answers it. So there's the Pashtun Wali has got 16 tenets, and these are basically the values and norms that the Pashtun tribe, which is the largest tribe in Afghanistan, lives under. Those 16 tenets, you would think could be interpreted in just one manner. Well, the Suleiman Kel tribe, as an example, is made up of 26 sub-tribes. Those 26 sub-tribes each view the 16 tenets of Pashtun Wali a bit differently. Okay. So the human terrain teams get down there inside these communities, get their understanding of how they view the 16 tenets of Pashtun Wali, give that back to us. We then incorporate that into our rehearsals so we can properly maneuver within their communities. So we're engaging the tribal leader of this village, the mullah of that district. So it enables us to do better maneuver, reduce the friction, reduce the risk to everyone involved. And here's the other thing, sir, we found quite interesting. the Afghan National Army folks are made up across all of Afghanistan. So their understanding of tribal dialects and tribal issues are not much greater than some of ours. And so these products were used throughout the entire combined force so we could reduce the number of kinetic or potential kinetic activities that otherwise may have occurred.
Okay. I've been to Fort Riley to see the MIT training teams there, that training regimen. How long does it take to form up an HTT and deploy that team?
So I don't know that answer, because my experience was when I was at the Joint Readiness Training Center at Fort Polk, Louisiana, I started asking for psychologists in that community because I was ignorant. I said, that's who I needed to help me understand the human terrain. And then a guy by the name of Steve Fondacaro showed up out of nowhere and said, what you need are anthropologists or people from the social science community. And so on the third day of my rotation at the Joint Readiness Training Center, 2 months before I deployed, 5 American heroes showed up and plugged in and helped us grow this capability. So I can tell you that we didn't do it right in terms of how to form it, man it, train it, and embed it. The formation that just replaced me linked in with their human terrain team prior to their deployment to their readiness exercise and stayed with them and is with them today. And that certainly feels, sounds, smells like that's more the right link up.
Are we using these tools in Iraq as well, or just in Afghanistan?
Sir, we are using the tools in Iraq, but that's really about the extent of my knowledge of what's occurring in Iraq. I'm fresh back from Afghanistan.
Sure. Well, thank you for your service, and you'll back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Gillibrand. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Mr. Lipinski was here first. I'm sorry. The dual committee there. I apologize. I looked at the wrong name on the list. We'll get you soon. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both Chairman Smith and Chairman Barrett for holding this hearing today. And I really wanted to go a little bit of a different direction here. And as the hearing charter said, we want to explore opportunities for partnerships between the DoD and NSF for this type of research. So I wanted to go down that road. Last year, there was a bit of a skirmish over social science research funding with NSF. And Chairman Baird led the way, and I joined with him to help protect that funding. And I am a political scientist, and so I have an interest in that. But what I really want to ask is, I want to start with Dr. Van Tilburg and then go to Dr. Segal, and then I want to hear what Dr. Weiss has to say about this. Dr. Segal is in academe. Dr. Van Tilburg has been there. What do you think the NSF should be doing in regard to any partnerships with the DoD? How much, and I want to also get into how much of a responsibility do you think NSF has for doing things like this? Should the NSF be purposefully focused on research that could help in this area, or should we be focusing the NSF so much in a particular direction? Let's throw out a lot of questions here. Let's see what you want to have to say. But is there value to research that's not directly related, say, to something related to the military that we have here, but may in some way tangentially help train somebody, a researcher who then could later do work in this area? It's all a question of the value of the NSF research, and that's why I wanted to get your ideas on that. So let's start with Dr. Van Tilburg.
Congressman, thank you for your question. Yes, I am very much in favor of the kind of unfettered basic science research that the National Science Foundation conducts, and I think there are often situations where without any kind of knowledge as to how that new understanding from their research will be used, that eventually our nation benefits greatly from that kind of knowledge. We do in our DoD basic science 6-1, so-called 6-1 research program, have a lot of grassroots interactions with the National Science Foundation staff. And I think it's actually quite common that the principal investigators in the universities who primarily conduct the National Science Foundation's research and our 6-1 research tend to be, if not one and the same individuals, then sitting down the hallway from those people who are supported by the other agency. And of course they run across each other a lot in the professional societies and world. My personal view is that yes, the National Science Foundation does in fact have as part of its charter to be concerned about national security. That is not foreign to their responsibility. But it's important for them to maintain the relationship that they have with the science community. This is a very long-term relationship that has been established, and I think we on the Department of Defense side have to develop the techniques that can draw upon NSF-funded research effectively for our purposes without interfering with their ability to work honestly and openly with their research communities.
Dr. Segal?
I agree with Dr. Van Tilburg. I think that the mission of NSF to sponsor unfettered research is paramount. At the same time, I think it's important for NSF, from the point of view of the country and the academic community, to recognize a responsibility to support research generally in the public interest, and I think national security is in the public interest. In terms of mobilizing human capital in support of national security needs, quite frankly, I think that NSF brings to the funding of social science research a level of credibility and legitimacy that in the current environment and probably since the Vietnam War, DOD has not had, for better or for worse, deserved or undeserved. And there are indeed a number of social scientists who do research that would be relevant to national security who would not go to DOD for funding. Others who probably would but do not have the same access to DOD, BAA's broad agency announcements that they do to information on what funding is available through NSF. So I believe that NSF funding in this area would increase the range of social science talent available to be brought to bear on national security needs.
And I'm sorry, we'll have to perhaps come back to this if we have more time. Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Colonel Schweitzer, it's good to see you back on this side of the world. We appreciate your hospitality when we were out there a few months ago. It's good to see you here. I apologize because I wasn't here early, and like Mr. Conaway, I don't want to replow old terrain for you as I'm sort of catching up. So I would just like, if I could, Colonel, to address a question and a thought with you. I know that part of the issue that you and others are dealing with over there is the Afghani government leaders themselves. And I know that there are a couple of examples, Governor Jamal, for example, top flight, first rate, some others not so. Does this tool, does the system, the HTS, and the people that are involved in that, does that help you identify the capabilities, the qualities, if I can use that word, of the Afghani leaders that you were dealing with or that others would deal with?
Sir, we did not use it in that manner. We used it truly to define the human terrain and the human dimension that we were operating within, and we were focusing it on the communities, the tribal challenges, the tribal norms, how those sub-tribes did and did not work together, how they worked or did not work together with adjacent tribes. And so we focused it truly on being able to paint the appropriate human landscape so we could operate within. Now, having said that, most of the governors are not from the provinces that they operate within. So these output products were incredibly beneficial for them as well, so they could create proper access. We found it really unique that matter of fact, the Pictia governor was from a different tribe, and he had great difficulty engaging his tribal leaders at the lower district and the village level. and he was using his own procedures and techniques that he had used in the tribe that he came from. Well, after we were coaching him collectively on, hey, look, it ain't working what you're doing, and the human terrain, the products that came out from the human terrain team were those products that we used to help him understand that community that he was trying to engage and discuss and deal with. So that's how we used. That's how we applied it.
So that tool is not only helpful to you and your soldiers for understanding the human terrain that they're navigating through, but you're actually able to turn it around and help an Afghani leader use it as well. But it didn't address the problem and couldn't of just corruption, low character or something like that might be in place.
Well, you can't help but get back information from the village leaders, the tribal leaders, the mullahs, when corruption's out there, when they think governance is not working on behalf of them. I mean, that does come. It's an output product. It's not the primary product, but it certainly is additional information that comes back. And so you do get this kaleidoscope of responses and data points to be able to, put into the kit bag to figure out, okay, how do we reduce this friction? How do we create this access? How do we then coach the governors, the police chiefs, the army chiefs to have a better behavior or proper behavior as expected by that community? And give them alternate options versus just one option. The same thing it does for us. And so what I had alluded to earlier was that these teams, the products that they're creating, they benefited the Afghan National Security Forces as much, if not more, than the coalition forces. To our moms and dads that are out there, that are that are providing their sons and daughters to go into uniform, they can rest assured that it's saving our lives. But in terms of the mission, it has a significant impact with developing governance within the Afghan structure, enhancing economic development, as well as developing the Afghan National Security Forces.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Gillibrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony and your work and your service. It really sounds like you have developed a program that is extraordinarily value-added. I want to ask Colonel Schweitzer, in your prepared remarks, and through your stated remarks, you went through all the advantages that you've seen, both on the ground, with our own troops, with reducing violence, with working better with the local governments. I just want a little more context about how are our men and women on the ground who are doing this work perceived?
You mean the human terrain teams, how are they perceived? I guess the best way to judge that is the access that they are and are not granted. Do I think that every engagement that the human terrain teams have had has been one of success? I'm sure that's not the case. I'm sure that there has been times that either it has stumbled or that a community has just not been willing to accept it because at the end of the day, it still is a foreigner on the other end of the discussion. And so there are going to be those challenges that are out there. But what I have found is that through time, if we don't use a Western watch that I alluded to earlier, and if we allow the Afghan condition set to be achieved, that access has never not been achieved. And that's just due to constant engagement, constant, consistent performance, constant behavior on both sides of the equation, so they can develop enough of a trust where they're willing to open up and discuss. But simply stated, we have never, I cannot recall a single instance where they did not gain access eventually. But I can tell you numerous times where we didn't gain it immediately. And again, that's because, we did default to our Western watch that we quickly threw away so we could focus on getting the right conditions set to establish the necessary trust that allowed the communication flow.
Have you considered, or is there already coordination with USAID, with CIA, with the State Department? Because it seems to me that, if you look at other areas where we are not combat focused, but more population focused and intelligence gathering focused, that this kind of information would be extremely valuable in other applications of the U.S. government's role. And I'm thinking of different applications, but looking at Pakistan, for example, when I was there last summer, we have certain missions there, intelligence missions, USAID missions. There's enormous amounts of efforts that go on there. And I'm wondering, is this something that you would like to see expanded, that it could be used in coordination with the other agencies so that everyone has the benefit of this very valuable cultural and ethnic information that could inform their operations and their missions to be more successful?
Ma'am, that's probably a bit outside of my own personal scope, but I'm pretty confident that this is not mutually exclusive to what we did in the last 15 months. I clearly could see the benefits as it could apply to different organizations and agencies to enable them to properly engage with communities. So that's probably about as far as I can go with it. Not because I don't want to go more. I'm not privy enough to the other agencies' missions. But I do not believe that it's mutually exclusive to just what we were doing.
Do any other panelists have any view on that? Do you have any knowledge of those subjects? Okay. Let me ask Dr. von Tilborg something. This training obviously is much more than just the do's and don'ts of a given society. And I'm thinking that, we have sensitivity training that we give our troops before they go into combat. Often they are deployed to Iraq, then Afghanistan, then some other location. Is this something that we can expand so that all of the men and women that we train for missions, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, will have the benefit of this kind of in-depth cultural knowledge?
Thank you for the question. I think it's up to our actual men and women in uniform to decide precisely what they need at each echelon level in the operating forces. But I think that probably every man and woman who goes over does need to have some sort of basic understanding of these kinds of cultural, social, religious, economic, political, etc. kinds of issues. I think that level of training is quickly dawning on the military, the need for doing that. I think the Marine Corps probably has picked up on this the quickest. My understanding is their facility down at Quantico called the KACL. I don't remember what it stands for, but it's cultural. The C in it is for cultural learning. Is running lots of young Marines through so that they have an understanding that is meaningful. We're not talking here about a traveler's, tourist's guidebook. This is information that needs to be of a different nature. Not everyone needs the same level of training. There are people who have special jobs that require very deep understanding, including language training, and others who can do a good job in what they're assigned with a lesser degree of training.
Thank you. Mr. McIntyre is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today. And Colonel, as one of those who represents Fort Bragg, let me state to you how proud we are of your service and your commitment and all that you do for the 82nd Airborne. I just simply wanted to ask, given the testimony and the questions have already been asked, a concern of how what you are doing may tie into the concern we hear over and over with regard to progress, both in Afghanistan and, for that matter, Iraq as well, about the situation involving the local police. I noticed in your testimony on page 5 at the top, you state that the true power brokers in the area were the mullahs, not the village elders, who were mostly Taliban supporters in a certain situation you were describing there. And later, in your next paragraph, you talk about the net effect of moving from 19 of 86 formal and informal districts supported the government. Today, you assess 72 of those districts to support the government, and you attribute that change, or at least some of that change, to HTT. Is this an area that can or is working with regard to helping an understanding, a respect, and a need for the work of the local police to be successful? Because when I was in Afghanistan and talked to Dan McNeil, our friend who you know has served from Fort Bragg for many years, that continued to be a concern, is the situation with the local police. And we've also heard that from other panels that have come before us.
So I think one of the overarching problems is corruption. And so whether that's corruption within the Afghan National Police or the governmental structure, no matter where it is, it's damaging. Because once you create a separation from the enemy, and you then get government to come down there to their community, government being represented by police, army, actual government employees, who then skim off the top or do not provide for the community, you then cause that community to say, forget government, I'm going to turn back towards the Taliban. The human terrain teams help us at the front end of this piece with gaining the appropriate access and providing us alternate options and courses of action to be able to conduct appropriate engagements so we can, A, link in those security forces or those government representatives with their people. If the government structure, the government representatives then are corrupt, that's a significant step back, and that has happened. And frankly, the remaining 14 districts, 4 of them are going to be real hard nuts to crack because that happened on a continual basis. We had a pretty good understanding of the human terrain, a pretty good understanding of the human dimension, the cultural expectations, and then we had governors or sub-district governors make poor choices that resulted in those communities hardening against their government. And so that's a different part of the problem, but in my opinion, it's one of the underpinnings that we've got to continually work at. Again, though, the human terrain teams enable us to get access and re-get access. And here's the other thing, sir, that was helpful, is when we did get these communities that were troubled, the human terrain teams helped us understand that human dimension even better, because that's the last place that we need to go shoot. The last place. When you have that kind of a problem, that kind of an attitudinal opposition to the government structure, going in there with force in Afghanistan is the wrong answer. You got to go in there with a better idea. You got to go in there with better performance, and you got to be able to access those communities, those villages, those tribal leaders, and show them that their government can and will provide for them in a manner that's based on integrity. And so they've been critical with us getting into the hard places.
If I can just clarify, and thank you for an excellent answer, if I can just clarify, so in places like those 14 remaining districts that you said are going to be pretty hard situations to deal with, is there a concentrated effort to coordinate the HTT with those that can influence to try to crack those hard nuts, as you said? In terms
yes,
of
sir. Here's the other dynamic that's occurring in Afghanistan. We have subordinated my brigade. I subordinated my brigade to the 203rd Corps Commander, Major General Halik. He has built a campaign plan. I mean, I just liken back to 5 years ago when they said they couldn't have a government because they didn't have the human capital. They couldn't have an army because they didn't have the human capital. And now here today, 4.5 years later, Major General Halik is developing a campaign plan that we're in phase 2 of cleaning out the provinces that he's responsible for and getting government down there to their people. But, sir, he's the one who has set the table. So these products that came from the human terrain team went into their effect cell, because they have a mirrored effect cell that our headquarters has, that went into their campaign planning. So they have a strategy to get after all 14 districts. Their next set of operations are occurring today and started about a week ago into one of those real hardened areas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Van Tilburg, I'm wondering if we put the same rigor in behavioral and social science research as we put into other areas of research, with things like metrics and whatnot. Part of the reason I wonder that is I've recently read a book by a psychologist who tried to explore why people turn to terrorism. And then there's been a considerable amount of controversy about that book regarding his methods and the conclusions that he reaches based on those methods. And it seems to me just inherently more difficult to have objective metrics and other standards for this area of research as physics or chemistry or something. Where are we? How does that shake out?
Well, Congressman, I would certainly have to agree with you that, but of course I'm not a researcher in this domain, and Professor Segal might be able to say that the metrics are in fact extremely rigorous. I think that it depends, in my experience, it kind of depends on the specifics, let's say social science that you are examining. If you're in a situation where you can examine, say, the reaction of an individual who is now tapping on with a pen, and you're able to make numerical measurements regarding that individual's reactions or behavior, I think you wind up with the kinds of traditional metrics that we use in other branches of science. In other areas, and for example, also in language training and language understanding, I believe that you can do relatively conventional kind of testing and in simulation types of environments. But then there are other areas where it is, I agree with you, very difficult. And I think fundamentally it's difficult because it's not that easy to run controlled experiments in some aspects of the social sciences. For example, in the case of the human terrain teams that Colonel Schweitzer has been explaining so well, you can't really do the controlled experiment of a particular scenario with a HTT and then run that same scenario without the human terrain team and be able to say, well, you see, in one example we had 9 casualties and in the other we had 3, and so that's the difference by having the human terrain system. I believe that is probably a fundamental difficulty in this business. However, I would say that in a sense, there is no less rigor in this field. They get as much rigor out of it as they can, in my view.
Well, a fair point. It just strikes me that when you're talking about people's motivations and policy is based upon an assumption of those motivations, it's somewhat murky territory. Dr. Segal, I'd be interested in your comments on this, and let me throw out one other aspect of it. I was recently on a commission that recommended that our nation take greater advantage of immigrant and expatriate communities in the United States to help aid our understanding in other nations, other cultures, and especially others' motivations, which is not so easy to study. Are we doing that? Do you agree we need to do that? How would we? And then in terms of the research that goes on, how do we tell whether it's good enough to make a policy decision on?
Well, thank you for those questions. I will certainly agree it is very difficult to be rigorous in the social sciences. I would argue because the systems that we study are so complex. I tell my colleagues at the University of Maryland that God must have loved the physicists. He gave them all the simple questions. But you start looking at complex individuals in complex social systems, you've got very, very difficult tasks. So I would say that for that element of the social sciences that is in fact oriented toward measurement and rigor, those of us who are influenced by positivism, we do the best we can. But as Dr. Van Tilburg said, we're dealing with situations where you can't bring things into a laboratory and hold variables constant. So you have to figure out what to do, and it's kind of like astronomers studying the universe. You know, it's out there. We can't bring it into the lab. We can still measure elements of it. We're not sure we know everything about it that we need to know. We're not sure we know what we need to measure, but we try. The experimental model doesn't fit. In terms of whether we should take advantage of immigrant communities to learn from them. I have argued repeatedly, my business is primarily military manpower, and I have argued that in the military we take less advantage of immigrants in the country than we could in terms of recruitment, which would help not only in terms of numbers, but in terms of a way of building cultural sensitivity and recognition of cultural diversity into the force. And I think on a national level we could do a better job of that. We have historically been a nation of immigrants. We have enriched our country because of the human capital brought in from other countries. There's a kind of pendulum swing against that right now in the country, I think, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah. Could I ask Dr. Weiss, do you have any comments on this, how you know whether the science is good enough?
In regards to the rigor of science, yes, I would certainly agree with my colleagues here that studying human behavior can be very problematic, much more complicated than studying the movement of atoms at times. However, I would also stress that we are now seeing the incorporation of new technologies and new ways of thinking about human behavior that are allowing us to provide added levels of rigor and that improve our understanding of basic human behavior. Just as one quick for instance, the use of functional magnetic resonance imaging to really get a literal picture of what is going on inside a human skull as somebody is undertaking a particular task. So we're getting more and more adept.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. I just had a couple more questions. I want to follow up a little bit on that last questions as far as the rigor of these particular social sciences. I guess it's more, well, first of all, in terms of Colonel Schweitzer's experiences, when you go into specific cultures, you can get reasonably specific answers in terms of the norms and mores of that culture that are very helpful. Now, it's not a guarantee. I'm sure not every Afghan in a given village adheres strictly to those cultures and mores, but it's probably a pretty high percentage. And that's my second comment, is that really what you're dealing with here is percentages. As you understand a broader population in a given area, you can say, 80% of the time we think this person will react that way, and they probably will. I mean, that's different than in physics where, 100% of the time when I drop the rock, it's going to hit the ground. But that is still incredibly valuable. I mean, to throw a basketball analogy out here, if you're picking who to put on the line, you pick the guy who shoots 80% instead of the guy who shoots 50%. Not a guarantee. Maybe the guy who shoots 50% happens to hit those 2 free throws and the other guy doesn't, but it significantly ups your odds of success. And that's why I think these social sciences are very, very valuable. I did want to give Dr. Weiss the opportunity to answer the question that Mr. Lipinski raised earlier about how the National Science Foundation and the broader scientific community reacts to sort of, if you will, I'll be a little bit more blunt than Mr. Lipinski, being dragged into the military world, and if there's any, sort of pushback on that, or if you see that as an incredibly valuable part of what you're doing, or is there more controversy within either NSF or the broader scientific community?
Well, within NSF, I do not see a sense of being dragged into anything. NSF, as has been mentioned, supports basic scientific research. And what we have found over time is that we receive unsolicited proposal to conduct research, some of which has clear and obvious applicability to military settings, as I alluded to in my oral presentation, and other research that we fund does not necessarily have any obvious application, but as the research develops and as the implications of the research evolve, what we find is that much of the research that, for instance, might have to do with the way that organizations are structured may have ultimately very clear applications in a military setting. We have on occasion been involved in collaborative work with the Department of Defense. We, for instance, last year collaborated with them on a solicitation, the topic of which was the detection of explosive threats. That was initially going to be targeted at the math and physics communities, but indeed the social behavioral economic sciences became part of that, and indeed several awards were made which deal with aspects of the psychology, detecting
who's going to plant the bomb? I mean, if you look into a community, I mean, it's part of the counter IED approach. Instead of just focusing on the explosives, focus on the people, and if you find them, it's as effective as finding the bomb.
Absolutely. Technology is wonderful, or can be, but the fact is that technology is used within a human context, and you have to understand the human context as well.
So just one more question for Colonel Schweitzer, and that was on sort of the role of our special operators. That's a jurisdiction or our subcommittee. We spend a lot of time focusing on it. And they have some training in this area, certainly in irregular warfare and counterinsurgency. Part of it is cultural awareness, and they have training within that. And I was wondering how their efforts, since they are such a large presence in Afghanistan, and their sort of cultural training meshes with the HTTs. how sort of short are they of what the HTTs have, and how do the two work together?
Yes, sir. That's a great question, because I think that may be some of the confusion. They're not. It's not the same. The cultural training that our special forces get is similar to the same training that the conventional forces get, with respect to cultural understanding and being able to grow the capacity of the individual soldier, his understanding of the cultures, the norms, and how the communities, their concerns and what the friction points are. What the human terrain teams do is they create access. What the human terrain teams do is they help us operationalize their values and norms so we can properly maneuver within them. I would argue that and I can't speak for the special operations community, but as they did operations in coordination with us, they absolutely leaned and relied on the products that the human terrain team produced.
Great, thank you. That's all I have. Mr. Baird, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Conaway.
If I might, Dr. Weiss, do you study the transition that ultimately winds up? We've got very poor phraseology in terms of describing these folks, but describe the radical, violent radical jihadists, the mindset that leads a person to strap something on themselves and walk into this room and blow themselves up. That person didn't start life with that being their goal, I don't think. Maybe they did. How do you look at, or is there someone within SF as a part of this cognitive, looking at that transition and how those folks go from, again, poor phraseology, moderates to fundamentalists to radical Islamic, or try not to use the word Islamic, but radical jihadists? How does that transition occur? Because if it occurs in poverty circumstances, like in Palestine, where there is no hope, no future, I can get my head around that. But looking at what occurred in England and other places where folks who were raised in a society where they were educated and had opportunities and had futures, and even doctors involved in this conduct, how does that, do you guys look at that issue?
Yes, we do. In fact, we have supported a number of researchers who are interested in exactly the sort of question that you're asking. And to jump back to the point I was making earlier, sometimes the insights that we gain into the question that you're asking come from a source that you might not have imagined to begin with. For instance, there are researchers at the University of Michigan who are interested in exactly the question you're asking, and are asking it in terms of what values within a society are sacred and therefore not negotiable, and what happens when we try to negotiate what they consider to be a sacred value, and in fact that results in increased radicalization. Now the point in part is that rose out of basic research that actually was initiated in Mexico to talking to farmers about their view of their local ecology. And from that basic research, these researchers were able to transition and apply their knowledge in a whole new setting, the one that you're asking about. We have supported research, funded research by other investigators looking at the question of whether it is poverty that breeds radicalization, and not intuitively. The answer is it seems not. In fact, as you mentioned, it is often individuals who may have at one point been at a poverty level but have risen and now have the freedom to act further on their radical ideas. So that to some degree it is not the poverty itself, it's the opening up, the availability of resources that liberates them to undertake these actions.
As that research progresses, will we reach a point where we can apply that to stop this radicalization? And the other question would be, are your researchers Muslims? because I don't know that I, as a Christian, can have any real positive impact on that progression in that stream. It seems to me that this has got to be fellow Muslims or Islamists who have got to figure out the way to stop that conversion from fundamentalists to radicals. And does that take it in? Is there something you can actually do with the research that we're coming up with?
Well, let me highlight a different undertaking that the National Science Foundation provides funding for, and that is the World Values Survey. This is a global survey of attitudes, and we, as well as a number of other nations, provide funds to gather these data, and researchers within the United States at Eastern Michigan University, who I believe are of Middle Eastern backgrounds, in fact, just last week were in Egypt at an international convention or symposium to discuss their findings regarding attitudes amongst Iraqis in this particular case, and how the data from the surveys could be interpreted to help mitigate the problems in the Middle East.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Baird.
Again, appreciate all your testimony. Colonel Schweitzer, just very briefly, I just want to thank you for acknowledging the people who stepped forward to help you with this. I know that in the academic literature there was some debate about whether it was appropriate for academicians to be helping the military, and there was actually some criticism about that, which I found rather frustrating. But I wish the folks who'd criticized those academicians could hear your testimony and hear that they were saving lives, not just U.S. lives, but coalition lives and soldiers on the ground and civilians to large numbers. So thank you for acknowledging them and for that recognition. And thanks to them on behalf of this committee. Dr. Weiss, one of the things that I've been particularly focused on as chair of our subcommittee has been grand challenges in the social sciences. And you could look at those as energy, healthcare, national security. And one of the questions as I look at research that we fund through NSF is a notion that they call path to impact. Within your comparable agency, I think it's down in New Zealand, refers to as path to impact. So someone proposes to NSF, this is the research we want to do. The question is, I think, on the mind sometimes of this committee and sometimes of the Congress, is if we're spending taxpayer dollars on research, where is the path to impact? And I know there's this balance between basic research, but somewhere the general public, the loggers, the fishermen, the steel workers, the nurses, whoever's working for their living, wanting to get the money out, they want to know what the path to impact is. How do you relate that to the testimony we've heard today and the challenges we face in national security?
Well, as mentioned, the National Science Foundation funds basic research, but we judge the proposals on two primary criteria. Those are the scientific merit, as well as what we call the broader impacts. The path to impact would be an alternative. And all proposals are judged on both those criteria. Now, granted that in some cases, the impacts may not be obvious at first, but what we have often found is that 10 years down the road, there may be a payoff that was never anticipated. But there can also be impacts that revolve around the basics of the research, and those are training future generations, research on areas that may not have any obvious immediate payoff, but which intrigue people, and as a result improve scientific literacy in our public. We do understand what you're saying, however, and we have made a concerted effort of late to ensure that the titles of research projects cut to the importance of it, that the abstracts of the awarded research demonstrates why the research does have the potential for an impact. So we are very sensitive to the point that you're raising.
I appreciate that very much. Dr. Segal, one final question is, you know, you've done some really remarkable work. I appreciated reading your testimony and the topics yourself and your graduate students and others have studied. One of the intriguing questions, and Chairman Smith and I were just discussing it briefly, so many of these cultures that in the environments we're operating in have just had generations now of horrific conflict. Afghanistan, Iraq, Darfur. I mean, it's not just that we're no longer in just the sort of symmetric warfare, but the cultures we're in, the people have been through hell, literally. Do we have some insights into how that's affecting people and how that can change the human terrain, as it were?
I certainly can't speak to changes in the human brain. That's for a physiologist. Terrain. Okay.
The kind of thing that Colonel Schweitzer.
Sorry. Clearly, we know that exposure to conflict has an impact on people. One doesn't have to be in an area of the world where conflict has been going on for generations. We can see it in the soldiers that we have coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. Where it has become part of the social fabric, there is every reason to believe, and I'm here talking about probabilities, this is not an area where we have rigorous measurement, that it will take a long time to get over it. We're not talking about, well, gee, we can improve the situation in Iraq or Afghanistan within a few years and then everything will be fine. You really have a generation of people on the ground who have grown up in that environment. And it's very possible that that generation will have to pass on and another generation that grows up in a different environment come to power in that area to really begin to see the long-term consequences.
One final comment, and it would be just, our country has invested many, many billions of dollars in mapping the physical terrain. The GPS systems which we now find in our automobiles were based on the recognition that it's foolhardy to send our military forces into a world in which they don't know the terrain. You're endangering the soldiers, you're endangering the civilians, you're endangering the success of the mission. What I find so encouraging and interesting and challenging about today's hearing is the recognition that that human terrain, which we may not be able to map from a satellite or trace with the GPS, may be absolutely as important to the success of the mission and the survival of our soldiers and the people we're trying to serve. And thank you for your testimony and your work. And thank the Chair for holding this hearing.
Thank you, and I will close simply by agreeing with everything Mr. Baird just said. I think that was the purpose of this hearing. I think it was very, very informative. We look forward to finding ways within both of our committees to be helpful to what all of you are working on, and I thank you for your testimony today. We are adjourned.